All right, welcome again to Unfiltered us. Carron and Rob here. We are starting the recording for the second time because we started about an hour ago and then we get invaded by a bunch of pesky kids. So yeah, doing this for the second time. We talk about our life, about parenting, about relationships and everything else. And we are inviting you to join us. So cheers. And
Cheers.
today we're going to talk about
Rupture and repair.
rupture and repair.
Yeah.
Good.
Rupture and repair is this term in psychology. Do you want to mix that into that?
Mhm.
So it's a term in psychology, and it refers to the process of when you have some kind of conflict with somebody, which is the rupture, and then in a good, healthy relationship, then there's the repair process afterwards, which is really, really important. And when you have rupture and no repair, it's a little bit like tearing a hamstring and not getting a full recovery and not having the rehab and etc. Whereas if you, for example, tear a hamstring and you then go through the right process in order to heal and recover, you can go back to being as strong as you were before and sometimes even stronger, right? So
Which I can attest to having
ruptured
ruptured my hamstring.
all your hamstrings.
All my hamstrings.
All of your hamstrings.
Beginning of this year, which was a fun 3 months of recovery, hospital, crutches, and physiotherapy.
So imagine you hadn't had the repair process. You'd basically
That
be a
would have
cripple.
sucked pretty badly. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank
So
God for modern surgery and thank God for
rehabilitation and that whole process, right?
yes.
But so that's a process, right? So, you know, a rupture and repair doesn't have to typically take 3 months. You know, I mean, for me, I tend to be a little bit more volatile than you. You tend to be very, very calm, and you don't tend to have these sort of rupture moments, whereas I tend to. And I've had to reconcile with the fact that as long as that rupture process is followed by repair, it can actually sometimes be a very, very helpful and very beneficial process, you know. So it's like that, going through that conflict, and then coming out the other side, repairing that, and then hopefully things can move on in a good and healthy way.
Yeah.
And
I think I think that's exactly the point, because a lot of times what happens is that you have conflicts which are kind of simmering on a lower flame. They never fully
rupture, right?
rupture. It never
Yeah.
comes to the full rupture process. But it also means they never get fully resolved because they never get addressed properly.
Exactly.
Right? And
And
so
they're just
whereas
like
if you have this rupture
sit there
process,
festering.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have this rupture process, that means that there is such a clear rupture happening that there almost is like a need to repair it from both ends,
Yeah,
right? So I think it's
absolutely.
quite often that only because of that rupture, the actual conversation probably starts, properly starts, right?
I mean, I think that there are better ways to cope with conflict. You know, I'm not advocating the rupture and repair process. I'm just saying if there is a rupture, that if it's followed by a repair process, it can be quite healing and quite positive, and you know, there is a potential upside. But I mean, obviously, the ideal situation is to be aware of one's emotions and to address these things as they arise in a more constructive and less destructive kind of manner. But that doesn't always happen, you know. And I think it also depends sometimes on the person's personality type, and you know what their relationship with managing conflict is like, what their relationship with anger is like. You know, do they suppress these things? Do they not feel comfortable expressing these things?
And I think a lot of people are also in a way scared of the rupture process in itself because they're afraid that the rupture is final and then there's no repair after that, which of course also can happen.
Can happen.
And so people try to avoid it getting to that point. But again, most likely in a lot of cases, it's better to let it get to this rupture point, but then consciously tackle the repair after
the
that.
repair process, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because I think some people do permanently avoid conflict, and I think that they really avoid hard conversations, right? So not only can they not have a difficult conversation in a constructive manner, they also don't know how to just actually have healthy conflict. Which I think sometimes can just lead to a person then just completely sort of one day having a complete and utter meltdown, and then it all comes out, right? So I think that can happen. And if you follow it with a repair process, then you can get somewhere with it. But I think for a lot of people, they just sit with this sort of simmering resentment or these uncommunicated thoughts and feelings, and because they don't know how to have conflict and how to have the repair process, and they also don't know how to communicate effectively.
And as you said, it's not that rupture should be the target of conflicts.
It's not the aim, right?
It should not be the aim. The aim should be to manage the conflict properly, right? But if there's no proper management of the rupture, then it's probably better to, if there's no proper management of the conflict, then it's probably better to have this rupture instead of just simmering.
Exactly. And all of these resentments building up and these uncommunicated expectations or annoyances or uncommunicated disappointment or needs or any of that kind of thing. And I think it's so interesting because I think sometimes that if people don't feel comfortable expressing negative emotions, it simmers and it festers. And I think it also sometimes comes out in a sort of a passive aggressive kind of way. And I think that, passive aggressive behavior is very, very difficult to deal with.
Yeah,
I think it's more destructive than somebody getting openly angry or annoyed or upset, because it's so sort of subtle and it's so passive. It's passive aggression.
And it's also way more long-term than the rupture, right? Because rupture typically happens once.
Yeah.
There's a spike of emotions, but then after that,
there's hopefully a healing process.
The healing process, which is way faster, whereas the simmering passive aggressiveness can go on for years.
Absolutely. Right? So. And then the person can deny it, right? So it's like, what are you talking about? I didn't say anything. Or the problem with passive aggressive behavior is that it festers and it simmers and it's sort of plausibly deniable. The person can say, what are you talking about? I never said that, or that's not what I meant by that, or and it's these sort of very subtle behavioral and communication cues where the person kind of has a feeling like you're not so happy, but they can't quite put their finger on it. It's never clearly communicated, and it just leads to unresolved shit just piling up under the carpet or just sort of festering like a wound.
It's a typical, how are you? Fine.
Yeah,
right? Fine.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Do you have a problem with me doing that? No.
Yeah, I never said anything. Yeah. Or it's an eye roll, or it's also just, I mean, I think there's so many ways that passive aggressive behavior shows itself. And I think a lot of people where they don't feel comfortable with those negative emotions, with expressing anger or having conflict, I think a lot of people, it then comes out in a passive aggressive kind of way, because I think anger is quite a natural emotion for us humans. I mean, I think some people are more prone to expressing anger than others, but I think
Absolutely.
it's quite a. I don't think that it's an unhealthy emotion. I think that society doesn't view it as acceptable, but it's the reality of being human.
Unmanaged anger is an unhealthy emotion,
Absolutely.
right? That's the problem.
Yeah.
And most anger stays unmanaged, whether it's internalized
Yeah.
or some sort of anger that erupts, but then the consequences are not being dealt with, right? So
Sorry, the what are not being
the consequences are not being dealt
Yeah,
with.
yeah, absolutely. And that's also very, very unhealthy when you have a rupture process and it's not followed by repair. That's incredibly damaging. So
Probably the one example would be where, if I think back to my youth, I had a bit of a strained relationship with my dad in particular. Strained in the sense that he was a very, it's just his character, like this Eastern European post-war, or actually, still in the war kind of generation, which was very totally different than what we are probably knowing today, and very unapproachable and everything. And so we had this very, almost like a formal relationship, right? So he would, until I was in my mid-20s, he would greet me like that, like, son, good to see you, right? Whenever we would see each other, like every half a year, like, son. And it was like very, like, we never really talked a lot about personal things. I mean, still to this day, it's not like a person where we talk about really private stuff. But then, there was one moment I remember where he had cancer back in the day, and at the same time I had a bit of a weird girlfriend at the time, and this whole thing escalated into like a conflict with my parents, and then essentially there was some things going on there. And then there was a moment where my dad really was actually I only saw my dad cry twice. Like once when I was around 5 or so, when he visited the grave of his dad who passed away in the war in Poland. And then the second time was there, right? When he actually, like, he said, like, look, I don't know how long I have to live. And now this shit is happening, right? This shit is whatever it was at the time, right? It's not important. And I think that was kind of a rupture in that moment, where it was almost felt like, okay, this father-son relationship has reached a point which has reached kind of the end of its current state. But then after that, what was positive, like a new relationship formed, right? And so now, while still, you won't change mid 85-year-old authoritative Eastern European dad, but it has dramatically changed to before, right? So we talk about way more things. I think the relationship is way more heartfelt and feels way more intimate. So
more authentic.
More authentic, yes. And so, and also more understanding, I think, in both directions, right? Because I think we both understood that there were some things which were lingering for 20, 25 years before that. And then it just never came out. And then with this outburst, it just all surfaced at once. And it felt like, oh shit, that's kind of literally reached the breaking point, and will there be repair? But then pretty quickly, actually, it kind of reformed, right? Now it's a way more stable and way more healthy relationship, and way more authentic relationship, and way more loving relationship. And so that is probably my strongest example of how these I want to say that, how these unaddressed simmering issues that you can sometimes have for decades in that case, right? So we're talking about was probably in my mid or end 20s. So that went on for, let's say, at least 25, if not 30 years, right? Where this conflict was always there, but was never talked about, was never addressed, was never processed. But then it had to come to the point where there was this rupture for a while, but then it rebuilt. And then that simmering conflict has kind of dissipated, right? Because it's no longer, it just all came out at once. And of course, there's always other things that you have in relationships with anyone. But I think that was solved. And that for me was quite an interesting demonstration of how the process can actually have a massive change.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great example. So how do you think the repair process started? It's easy to understand how the the build-up of the negative emotions and the unexpressed stuff and it's easy to understand where that comes from, but how do you start the repair process?
Well, in that case, the repair process almost started naturally, because simply at that point in time we didn't know, how this cancer thing will end, right? So which direction, will there be another year or not, or what's going to happen? And so, while I don't think there was an explicit processing of, or there wasn't an explicit repair process, or an explicit and conscious effort to repair, it was more like, okay, well, great. So we have two things on the plate. We have cancer, we have a strained relationship or a broken relationship. And given that we don't know what the outcome of the first thing will be, so maybe let's try to fix the other thing, because that we have an impact on. And that's how it started, essentially.
So, like, also there's this acknowledgement that the relationship's important.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, like, I'm an only child, so whatever relationship you have with your parents, I think there's always a special relationship, of course, right? And particularly if you have only one child, and yeah, so in that particular case, yeah, so I think in that particular case, the reason was simply, if we don't fix it now, there might not be a second chance to fix it, because there might not be a second chance at all, right?
So in a way, yeah, you had a bit of external pressure, which also created more of a feeling of wanting to repair that relationship, because otherwise it could potentially remained in a ruptured state.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So it could have just stayed in that ruptured state, and then there would have been more anger and resentment and things like that festering. But instead, it was this acknowledgement that you value the relationship, that you actually love each other, even if you have conflict, and that there was a desire from both sides to repair the relationship.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and so, yeah, in a way that then became a blessing, right? And it became something positive and healthy, as much as that was probably really, really difficult to go through at the time.
No, absolutely. And yeah, sometimes this, in the same way how rupture can happen through some external influence, repair can also happen with the help of some external influences, right? So
that's true.
But how would you? I mean, that's a bit of an extreme example. How would you typically approach the repair process? Because that's probably what most people are afraid of, and that's probably why most people are afraid to let this endless simmering get to that point, because they don't know what's coming after. They don't know, will there be a repair process or not, or they are afraid that no, this will actually never. This is beyond repair, or this will cause so much damage, collateral damage, that it's going to be all.
I mean, I think for me, I I feel like I have little mini rupture and repairs. on a weekly basis with my teenage daughters, and maybe that's just the dynamic that we've gotten into. But I think from my side, first of all, I think in the moment, while everybody's angry and upset, it's pointless even trying to start.
Hello. All right, so interruption number, you stopped counting. It's Friday
42, I think.
night, so pesky teenagers all over. But yeah, we
were talking about repair and
like how does the
how
repair
does the repair start, or
starts or how should you approach the repair process under normal circumstances, so to speak?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what I've certainly experienced is that while somebody's angry or upset, that's definitely not the time to try and start a repair process. And I think it's really helpful to just give the other person time to process stuff, calm down, maybe think about what they've said, think about what you've said. And then I think it also depends on the personality. Like some people, if they're hurt or upset by what you've said, are going to completely withdraw and going to give you the cold shoulder and not going to want to engage. And that's then harder. Whereas if somebody's a little more forgiving or a bit softer, then it's probably easier to start that repair process. So I think it depends a bit on the personality of the person that you're dealing with. You can't just sort of do a copy-paste recipe. And I think that the really important thing is that you are authentic when you go and try to start the repair process, So
And what do you mean if you say authentic? How can a repair process not be?
Like you can't go in
authentic?
and say, start blaming the other person or start telling them what they did wrong or why you were pissed off with them, or that's not going to help, right? It's just going to start the fight again. So I think enjoy. I think when it's kind of a case of like it might be like, I think I may have overreacted, or like or an apology, if an apology is necessary. And I mean, I think that there's definitely a time and place for an apology. I think particularly if you've done or said something hurtful or unkind, to come with a genuine apology where you're like, I shouldn't have said that, and that must have been very hurtful, and I'm really sorry. And I will try not to do that again. Where you express a sincere apology, you understand the impact that it's had on that person.
Yeah.
And then you also express a willingness to change or a desire to change. So I think that those are like the sort of foundational elements of a good apology. I mean, it also doesn't help if you having these sort of rupture moments and you keep coming back with this repair apology and you keep doing the same kind of thing. I mean, that's not helpful. The person's not going to trust you. But I think if you can come with an authentic and heartfelt apology if it's necessary, and not that an apology is always necessary. I think sometimes you've just got to come and say, like, I think you've got to be authentic and you've got to be a little bit vulnerable and you've got to let the other person see where you were coming from, but also at the same time try and acknowledge where you think they might have been coming from. So I think after a rupture event like that, I think it's really helpful to just stop and think, okay, well, what was that person's perspective? What are they possibly thinking? What were they upset about? Or what came out of this whole rupture process? Like what are they feeling and thinking? And what am I feeling and thinking? At the end of the day, we're just these emotional beings, and we're so triggered by each other. And you've got to acknowledge that, to even start that repair process, I think.
Or maybe to give you the opportunity to eat some food here. One thing that I would be interested in is even going one step back, when do you think does rupture actually starts? So how can you recognize this rupture moment? I mean, there are certain cases where it's clear, right? If if you're whatever throwing plates and not talking to each other for days, it's quite clear. But I think there's a fine line between sometimes this passive aggressiveness and then an actual rupture that's happening. So in your opinion, what defines that rupture moment?
I mean, I think that that's the nature of rupture, is that it's very clear to me. But and I think the problem when a rupture is happening and it's sort of underground and not expressed, I think that that's essentially just a very unhealthy unraveling of a relationship, or unraveling of unraveling of a relationship. So
Because I want to give you one example. So let's assume we would be getting into some sort of fight. Doesn't necessarily have to be a little literal eruption of emotions, but just, let's say, some sort of disagreement about the topic. And there might not be that moment where it's a clear rupture, but one of us might feel, this really hurt my feelings, right? And so while you might not even say that out loud, for you or for me or for whatever the person is, there might be rupture in the sense that, okay, that was kind of one step too far, and now I'm hurt, and now I'm kind of retracting. So you wouldn't see that from the outside, you wouldn't see that from, maybe not even from the other person, but there might be some sort of rupture happening on either side. So how do you, that's why I'm asking, how do you recognize, or how do you define these rupture moments?
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. And I think that that's where the honest communication and being authentic and all of those things are so important, and this is something we've spoken about before, where, to be able to go to your partner and say, you know what, that actually really hurt me or really upset me. Maybe I overreacted, or, maybe you didn't mean it that way, but this is what I felt, or this is what I experienced. And to then be able to have, so I think it's important to be able to recognize in yourself where you've had that feeling and where it's had some kind of damage or some kind of impact on you, and then to go and communicate it to your partner in a clear way without blaming the other person. So I think if you can do that, then you prevent the big rupture, right? But if you let these little hurts or these little slights or these little offenses kind of just be brushed under the carpet. Well done, Carron. Oh shit, there's a Mac under here.
Oh, interruption number, I forgot how much.
35.
35. Spilled glass of wine. So
Wasn't me.
I think it's going to be a very interesting cut today. So I don't know if that even works. We're going to upload it anyway. Only getting better. So, but yeah. So cheers again with the new glass.
Cheers again. So we were talking about, when you have these things that maybe hurt your feelings, and maybe there is actually a little bit of a rupture. But it doesn't come out in like a big, shouty, angry moment, right?
Yeah, because there might be not even just a little bit, but I can imagine many situations where a person is hurt so much that actually the rupture is quite big. It's just not communicated to the outside, right? So,
especially if you're somebody like you who doesn't show you're not emotionally volatile, whereas I'm, let's say, emotionally labile. Like I'm, no, but I mean, I'm much more expressive with my emotions,
Sure.
And I think, I mean, from when I was in the second grade, my teachers used to say, you can always tell exactly what Karen's thinking. So I think I'm quite bad at hiding my emotions. And I also grew up in a family where, we must have some Italian blood or something because we're always quite expressive. So I think in that kind of environment, it's much more clear what's going on. Whereas for you, I think you learned to not show those emotions and not show when you were hurt.
Exactly. We don't show emotions, right? It's like,
Yeah.
especially as a man, you don't show emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's, you just deal with it yourself.
Internalize it.
Suppress it, get over with it, and don't whine and bitch and moan about it. Complain it, exactly.
And yet it still has an impact, right? So
no, of course,
these things just gradually degrade your relationship or relationships, or degrade your intimacy, or degrade the love that you have with the other person, etc.
Yeah. So since we were talking before the wine, I think next time we should serve the wine to you in one of those little
sippy cups.
Sippy cups. You have the ones that get.
Yeah, that's what I need.
Always good.
You hurt my feelings.
No, since we're talking about ways to approach it, I forgot who it was who told me that. And maybe it'll come to me later on, but someone once told me that he or she, I don't even remember that, made it a habit of never letting a day end, or going to bed without addressing kind of what's an open point, right? Mm-hmm. So in the sense that you never know if you're going to wake up the next day or next morning, right? So at least close the loops of the day, right? Whatever it is. Even if it's just like, this hurt me, or an apology. And you don't need not some things cannot be addressed the same day, month. Sometimes maybe you need to have some days in between, some space in between, some time to process stuff. But I really like the approach that don't let things go, I don't want to say unnoticed, but don't
let things fester, I think.
Yeah, don't let things fester. Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I think does every issue need to be resolved? Does every little tiny slight or hurt or whatever need to be addressed? And God, I think that would be exhausting, right? So sometimes, you might just sort of contextualize it for yourself and say, okay, well, maybe he had a bad day and that's why he was a little bit grouchy, or maybe I'm being overly sensitive because I have PMS, or maybe I'm overreacting because of something that had happened earlier in the day that sort of triggered me. So, and sometimes I think that you can resolve something in your own mind and it's not a big deal, right?
And sometimes things just resolve
without
anything, right? So have a good night's sleep.
Yeah.
The next morning you're no longer grumpy, you no longer have a headache, you're no longer whatever, frustrated by the day. So oftentimes things just go away.
But I think if you're waking up and that thing's still on your mind, or it's still hurtful, or it's still present for you, then I think it's good to bring it up in a non-confrontational way. So I think, but that requires a huge amount of vulnerability and honesty, and so if you've got that kind of relationship, it's great. I think it's very difficult if you don't feel like you can be open and honest and vulnerable, or if the other person's going to shut you down if you come with the, like that bothered me a little bit, or, I was a bit hurt by that, or whatever, if you're going to be shut down, I'm told you're overreacting, or you being a drama queen, or stop complaining, or whatever, then it's very difficult to express that. And I think that's when the passive aggressive behavior starts, because, it's interesting because I think in my family, I think there's a fair amount of passive aggressive kind of undertones, and if I look back at my previous relationship, I think I was always trying to be perfect, right? So I didn't want to be difficult. I didn't want to be overly demanding. I didn't want to be a drama queen about anything. And so I would just which is quite unlike me, because I am actually quite emotional and quite sort of labile and whatever. But like there were certain things where I just shut it down, suppressed it, didn't bring it up because I didn't feel like he would hear me or meet me where I was at or whatever. You
didn't want to cause a problem, right? You didn't want to be difficult,
yeah,
right?
exactly. I didn't want to be difficult, right? And yet I think probably that resulted in me being subtly sort of passive aggressive towards him sometimes, which I don't think was helpful for the relationship. And that was something that I only thought about like literally a couple of weeks ago after I watched something and it was talking about passive aggressive behavior. And I was like, I think I might have been guilty of that. And I don't even know that he would be able to label it. But I think that there was an element there because I didn't feel like I was in a position where I could talk about my anger or my frustration or my loneliness or anything like that. Because whenever I did try to raise these things, I was kind of shut down and I didn't feel like he wanted to listen or wanted to meet me halfway. So then I think then it presents as passive aggressive behavior, so yeah, I think you can get into quite a tricky kind of cycle and loop there.
I'm just trying to think, what are the potential scenarios that you would typically see? So the one thing is you feel there was a rupture, but it's not expressing itself equally for both people. So it almost turns into a grudge held by the other person. That's the topic of the last recording we made a couple of days ago.
And the grudge is going to present then as passive aggressive behavior.
And the grudge exactly is going to
or aggressive behavior, but
find a new form then over time, right? I mean, there obviously is the clear explosive rupture,
which is quite easy to spot, right?
Which is quite easy to spot. So that's a good thing. But then I think two branches out of that is the explosive rupture where kind of both people say, well, okay, that really sucked, right? That really actually, because then sometimes you just fight and maybe you have, all sorts of things are being said that you shouldn't say, that you would not usually say. And then both people at the end of the fight know, shit, that went a little bit too far, right? From both ends, right? So everyone feels guilty. And I think that those are the ones which are relatively easy to handle because both parties, or maybe there's even more parties involved, they all know, okay, well, that was, okay, that was not cool, right? That was not okay.
And then both parties are sort of willing to repair, right?
Exactly. That's like, okay, so let's sit down.
Both wrong.
Let's talk about it. I mean, we both have our points. You said some things, I said some things. Both are not cool, but there seems to be an issue here. So let's get to the bottom of it, and then just let's get it out of the way. So that's I think that's an relatively easy outcome. Not necessarily pleasant, but it's easier to handle. But how would you deal with a rupture where it's clear that there's a rupture, but maybe one person is so hurt or so emotionally involved that it's not done with, okay, I'm sorry, let's start anew and then let's try again tomorrow. So how would you deal with these situations? How do you find yourself in a situation like that? How do you find back to yourself or to your partner, whoever it is?
Yeah, then it's a more difficult repair process, I guess. And I think the repair process needs to come from both sides, right? So it's like, I think sometimes you've got to, if you're the party that's been deeply hurt, and sometimes people deeply hurt somebody else. And, there's no, let's call it justification for it, or there literally is one injured party or one victim and one perpetrator, right? So that can absolutely happen. And I think it's really difficult if the perpetrator won't take responsibility and won't acknowledge that what they did was wrong. Then I think it's actually impossible to have repair. So I don't think all ruptures end in repair. and then the victim is just left with dealing with it on their own, right? So there's no repair process there, and I think that that's so often the case when people have like suffered trauma or have had bad things happen to them, or they've been the victim of a crime or sexual assault or a war or something like that, so where they really sit with this other party not taking accountability, where there is no repair and they're left on their own to pick up the pieces of their life and try and put themselves back together.
Yeah,
right?
or in some cases there might be a rupture where the other party just isn't accessible anymore for any kind of repair process, right? Because maybe, as I say, maybe there was a situation where there was the circumstances, war is a quite extreme example, but definitely something, or maybe you have a fight with a family member and that person passes away, or you never see that person again, or
that person's just unwilling to speak to you,
or the person's just unwilling to speak to you, exactly,
and like is entrenched in their position that they feel that they're right, and they just refuse to even speak to you. I mean, that can also happen.
Exactly. So how do you repair?
I mean, I think it takes both parties to be able to repair something. You've either got to, then you're left to repair on your own. And I do think that that's doable. It's a different process, I think, and so like, I think if you want rupture and repair in a relationship, both parties have to come to the table and both parties have to be willing to.
Yeah, it's. I would maybe disagree in the sense that you sometimes simply don't have that option, but so there still needs to be a way to repair, but then it's just going to be a one-sided repair. But that's all it is, right? It's all that's available. It's all that's wanted, because maybe the other person doesn't want repair. They just retract. They're happy with never speaking to you again. But still, there needs to be a way to repair for whoever is left, right? If it's one, like, rupture can not only happen one-to-one, can be like an end-to-end relationship, right? There can be multiple people involved, can be whole families involved, can be children involved, parents involved. So it's not one-on-one relationship. It could be that's multiple kids and two parents or grandparents or other family members, or in a business environment there can be multiple people involved. So it's not a simple relationship. And it's quite common that certain parties will no longer be available for the repair process, but still we need to come to a closure or to a repair process. And I think that's then the cases where what we usually call finding your peace with something. Right? And actually, when I was driving in my car yesterday, I was listening to an interview with God, why did I forget the name? Silence of the Lambs.
Anthony Hopkins.
Anthony Hopkins.
Oh,
yes.
right.
So I was driving back to. I was driving and I saw this interview on YouTube. I listened to the interview on YouTube, of course. My car, I don't watch interviews, just to be clear on that. So I listened to that interview, and I think the podcast, is literally called The Interview, and I believe it's like something like a BBC thing or whatever. And Anthony Hopkins apparently has released an autobiography. I don't know if it was recently or a longer time ago, but they were talking about the autobiography at least a couple of times in the interview. And what I heard in the past, but I wasn't fully aware until I listened to the interview, is Anthony Hopkins has one single daughter, and they've been out of touch for like 50 years now, almost. So there was some sort of rupture in the past. He's 87 now, and there's just no communication going on, right? And he apparently, and I need to actually get the book for us. He apparently writes about it in his book and how this all happened. And he initially in the interview was like very, very hesitant. They actually said that he doesn't want to talk about the topic, and then the interviewer said, "Well, but you write about it in your book." Like, yeah, I write about it, but I don't talk about it in a way. But then the interviewer said, "Well, look, I'm just asking not to be sensational. I'm asking because I haven't been in touch with my dad for 20 years, right? So it's like he wanted to know what happened there and how he deals with the whole situation. And so Anthony Hopkins said, look, from his end, he made attempts to get in touch, right? And apparently the most recent attempt was that his wife sent an invitation to some whatever, and there was just no reply whatsoever, right? There's nothing coming back. And he said, look, I have two options. I can hold a grudge for the rest of my life, right? Which is only gonna make me suffer. Or can just say, look, and he said it a few times, like in a few years we'll all be cold and in the grave. So let's not let ourselves to be dragged down by holding grudges and by just trying to resolve things that cannot be resolved, because things are like they are, and then he needs to be
like acceptance, like
you just certain things you just do accept as a reality, and say, look, okay, that's what it is. Maybe I tried all I could. Is it frustrating? Maybe, but should it define my life moving forward? No, right? Because he said, like, for him it's all about enjoying life till he gets, right? And said that's what counts at the end of the day. And so, yeah, I think there are situations where just rupture cannot be repaired,
always be repaired,
but it can be repaired in the sense that whoever is left can just make peace with it, right? It needs to make peace with it. We say, like, okay.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, I mean, that's then your choice, right? Do you accept it? Because you really got to accept that it is intractable and it can't be solved, and then make your peace with it, and let go of your grudges and all that kind of thing that go with it. Or do you hold a grudge and be resentful and hold on to that pain for the rest of your life? I mean, that is a choice, right? At the end of the day.
Yeah. And I was actually the other day when I was doing my cursor stuff and programming and whatnot, and I was waiting for replies, I was kind of with one eye watching this documentary on Swiss television, which was quite interesting, because there was one reporter that spent about 20 years following a career criminal, like a career white collar criminal that defrauded people out of the pension funds, and was apparently like a very successful businessman, but it was like all the funds were just misappropriated and everything, and so he followed him over roughly 20 years, literally to his death, right? And so the whole documentary started with him visiting a person in prison. So he went to prison when he was in his mid-40s, and he had to go for 15 years, right? And so the interview started, and apparently they were in touch even before that, but the whole documentary started with that criminal being close to being released, right? And so the first interviews were actually still in prison, where they talked about, what's your status in prison, how did you deal with it, and the other person was an interesting character, because he was, I'm sure he must have been a very smart person, very narcissistic, right? In a sense, like it's like, yes, maybe I defrauded some people, but if they were too stupid to understand what's going on, it's all their fault. And then there's other people doing worse stuff, and
Justifying everything.
I'm a genius in my own regard, and so he was like very, very, very convinced of himself. And the whole documentary was filmed every like 2 or 3 years. They had a segment where they met and then discussed what happened, and so the initial contact was first in prison, and then when he was released, and then if you after prison, 15 years in prison.
How do you get a job?
Well, there's a lot of things, like how do you find an apartment or anything, right? So apparently, at least here in Switzerland, there are social services where they take care of that. So literally, he went out of prison and then he met his social service,
social worker.
Social worker. He's, look, this is going to be your whatever little two-bedroom apartment, and we get you some furniture, and we got some of the stuff that you put in the storeroom 15 years ago. We got that for you. And good luck, and call me when you need something, right? So, but at least there's some sort of
there's some follow-up.
Follow-up, and that person did have a brother that was part of the documentary. Did have 2 children, but they were quite removed from each other emotionally,
like estranged.
Estranged, and so it was interesting to see like how all these different things, like so in prison, then just being released from prison, then. What did he do? Like, so he started a new company, right? Doing asset management for other people.
Did anybody trust him?
That was the interesting thing. Like, even the interview said, like, somehow he managed to be able to rent a huge fucking office. It was like, I'm gonna have like 12 people, and there's gonna be 5 people in here. Get people working for him that trusted him.
Wow.
And they were sitting in this like little office, like total chain smoker, like smoked through the whole documentary. Like, I'm one of the best person in the business and one of the smartest persons. So
convinced of his own.
So convinced of his own. And then like fast forward 1 year, next court hearing, because he did
say back in jail.
He defrauded people again of money. And like, no, it's not fraud. It's like just a misunderstanding, and I'm gonna pay him back, and yada yada yada. Like that's like absolutely like just
didn't learn his lesson.
Didn't learn his lesson, right? And then it kind of it was following his life, and then what happened was that he had these conflicts with his brother. He even defrauded his brother, right? So he's like there were two I don't know if they were, I think age-wise they must be very close, right? So also, and so they were sitting, there was like one little episode or one little part where he sees his brother again after so many years and visits him at his home, and they're sitting on the sofa and like and joking and laughing, and like that guy, I borrowed him some money of my pension fund, and then he always told me he will pay it back, and then he never paid it back. I'm never gonna see the money again. And then even the reporter is like, so how come you don't have any issues to like defrauding your brother? And then he's like, so like it's so like he was kind of uncomfortable about that. But then also the relationship with his kids, when on his like 60th birthday. So I think he left prison when he was around 55, and I think the documentary ended when he passed away like at 72 or so, right? And so they're gonna 60th birthday. He's then he's not seeing his kids, but they sent him some shirt and some flowers and some chocolates, whatever. Still, but on his 70th birthday, he's like completely alone. And then kind of the whole thing ends like there's all these open ruptures in his life that he never closed, right? And then towards the end of the documentary, literally the reporter is the only person left that
has remained in contact.
That he remained with contact with him.
It's almost like the closest he's got to a relationship, right?
And he was, and he's always like in the beginning, like when he gets out of prison, he's like starting his business. I'm the greatest and arrogant, and then part of his, they don't put him back in prison, but like he has to do like whatever 1,000 social hours, and then he becomes like very quickly, because he's a greater, he becomes like head of all the prison workers, and then just bosses people around like, oh, go clean there and go clean there, like doing like cleaning up streets and stuff, like whatever you do, like these social hours. So you really, like, you can see like he's good at
charismatic,
charismatic and
actually,
good at catching people, and he's like this very grossly obese, chain smoking, unattractive guy. The whole documentary is like, he's so overweight and such a bad smoker that he can hardly talk without huffing and puffing. Then he somehow manages to find a girlfriend, and he has to do some like social work because he's forbidden from starting his own company anymore, right? And then of course, like, I could have been a millionaire again, but the state there's injustice from the states that I cannot do this anymore, so now I need to sit here and then
total narcissist,
plug together almost like a special needs facility where they just do some menial task, whatever, like clipping things together and do like, it's great. They sent him, and like, but he even manages to find a girlfriend there who is like probably 30 years younger.
Incredible,
and then it's still with his brother, and he's also part of that. And then towards the end of the documentary, like all these ruptures just they never get resolved, and then he just loses everyone in his life. Like on his 70th birthday, like no one calls him, his brother doesn't call him, his kids doesn't call him. The reporter is there, but it's the only person like to do another interview segments. Girlfriend is gone. No, not in touch with his brother for many years now, and so like his life essentially ends. Then at some point he gets like kidney cancer and bladder cancer, and just withers away over the last 2-3 years from of the documentary. He even meets the prison director. He was still the prison director 15 or 17 years later, and he said, look, I think I had it better in here than I had it on the outside, right? Because at least there was structure and something like that. And so essentially, like, at the end of the day, it's like he just passes away, and just no one gives a fuck, right? It's like, and then his brother, like the reporter visits, his grave. His brother visits the grave for the first time, or like not even the grave. Like they put him in like one of those mass community graves where just like they have in Switzerland, where you don't even have your own gravestone. It's like you just like essentially they just say, okay, this is like for like an anonymous grave. So this is quite usual, and most cemeteries have that in Switzerland. So where you don't want to have that, you get a little like a name tag somewhere on the wall, then everyone just gets same place essentially. So his brother, who but then is also like in a wheelchair, and just visits the grave, and like, so do you miss your brother? And he's like, oh no, not really. Right? It's like, and it was so interesting to see that how all these unresolved problems that he never wanted to resolve, because he thought he's invincible and he's in the right, and it's
to play in the rupture, right?
Exactly. It's everyone just misunderstanding him and misunderstanding his genius, and whatever he did wrong actually wasn't wrong, but it's more like, no, that was a big like
he was a victim.
Yes, that's like there's a self victimization. But then the end result was like, no, he was left with nothing, literally nothing and no one, and that was quite interesting. Sad, but interesting to watch. Tragic, yeah.
Tragic life. Yeah. But what's so interesting there is, like, and that's what needs to happen with the repair process, is that you to have a good repair. If you've done something wrong or harmful to another person, you have to acknowledge that. You can't ignore it or say that it didn't exist. You can't gaslight the other person that they were just imagining that was hurtful or whatever. That's not a repair. So he never, ever, ever repaired any of those relationships.
That's my point, exactly.
And so all these ruptures and no repair, and he landed up alone, and alone, right?
Yeah, no, but it was really quite interesting. Like one of the last scenes, like him, living in this little shitty 2-bedroom apartment, and literally the same couch that he moved in with. You could see like in the last scene, like dirty and worn off, whatever. Then he's sitting on this, like, still fat, still like even worse voice, and still chain smoking, like sitting there just crying, and then like, yeah, just like I have nothing, right? And then there was, because there was no repair, right? And I think that's the risk if you don't, in one way or the other, close these loops.
Tragic story.
It is, yeah. Quite interesting.
Yeah, fascinating. But yeah, I had a thought now. What was it? I mean, clearly that guy was quite an extreme case, right?
Of course. Yeah.
And it sounds like he was a narcissist, and also sounds like he never ever acknowledged that he'd done something harmful or done something wrong, right? So he caused all of these ruptures, caused all of this damage, and yet could never actually acknowledge that, and could never accept responsibility for that.
Yeah. And even in his wording was interesting, because in German there are two different words, Betrüger and Hochstapler. One's like a fraud, and the other one is like a crook.
Okay.
Right? And then whenever the reporter said, "What, but you've been a crook all your life?" Like, I'm not a crook. I'm criminal, but I'm not a crook. Right? Like, there was like still important
Subtle distinction.
the subtle distinction between, like, yes, I might be a criminal, but I'm not a crook. Right?
Interesting. Yeah. Certain arrogance to that, right?
Yeah,
Certain,
like
I'm smart.
I'm
right?
smart. Like, I'm smart.
I'm not
like,
just a crook. I'm
yeah,
a smart criminal, right?
Exactly. That's what I say.
Oh my God, total narcissist. Wow, so interesting. But yeah, so I mean, that's a great example of extreme ruptures that never get repaired, and what that lands up looking like at the end of your life, right? So yeah, I mean, I think in conclusion, I think ruptures are a natural part of being human, and then it's how you choose to repair, right? And I think if you want to repair in a healthy way, you've got to look into yourself and see, what could you have done better? Where were you wrong? How did you hurt the other person? How did that other person hurt you? And then move forward in an authentic and
Yeah, because I
an
think
authentic way.
in this last example, I'm 100% sure if you would rewind the clocks, and if that person had handled the rupture with his children, for example, differently, he wouldn't have died alone and forgotten and ignored, or like not even forgotten, like not forgotten, but alone and rejected by everyone, right, in his life. But he chose to.
He also chose never to take accountability for what he'd done.
Correct, yeah.
Right, and to never acknowledge what he'd done wrong. So I think.
So I think that's a very important point, right? So part of the repair process, and I think that holds true whether it's with the other party still involved, the parties still involved, or whether it's just something that you need to do for yourself, is looking at how much accountability you can take for yourself. Because in every process that involves rupture, there's at least a little bit of accountability on both sides. Yes, there's ruptures where it's mostly on one person, but even if it's just completely one-sided and driven by one party, there's a certain amount of accountability in the sense that, did you make enough effort to understand the other person? Did you make enough effort to understand where the other person is coming from? What's triggering them? What maybe your behavior has triggered, or even if it's just completely from the other, completely driven from the other side, and there's no fault on your side, then your accountability would still be, okay, well, have I tried to understand where the other person is coming from? Even if I did nothing wrong, maybe if there's a fact, usually I think there's, whenever there's rupture, there's a bit of fault on both ends, but at least the accountability lies in trying to understand, okay, why is the other person behaving the way he or she's behaving, right? And I think that at least that is your accountability, because then maybe even if it's not your fault, even if you can't repair it, even if there's no chance to repair it for whatever reason, then at least what this will help you with is understanding why the other person has behaved like that, right? And I think that alone can be, can be very helpful.
Absolutely. I mean, I think just to have, and I think that's really essentially that whole repair process, is to hold both perspectives in mind. To have good repair, whether it's that you opening yourself up to listening to that other person, or just trying to sort of consider where they're coming from or what their perspective may have been. And I think that's healing for the person who, I think it's that in itself can be healing for the person who's for both parties, but for the person that's sort of like thinking about that. And like we also talked about, sometimes there's a rupture process where it is by no fault of the person who's sort of been the victim of the offense, right? So, but I think that's also important to acknowledge. Sometimes you simply are the victim, and then you've got to look at, and if this keeps repeating and keeps happening, and this pattern of behavior is always continuously repeating, then you've got to look at, is this a healthy relationship, right? And is this something that you want to continue, or is this something where the other person is never taking accountability for the rupture, the other person is effectively abusing this relationship, and then I think in that case you need to sit with the decision of, do you walk away from this relationship, but I think that's an entirely different topic of conversation, and certainly not what we're really covering and talking about today. And I think what we're really talking about today is more just in a relationship like that these sort of rupture moments happen, and that in a relatively normal, relatively healthy relationship, that repair process is so important.
Should we leave it here?
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, thank you all for listening. I hope this video material is even remotely usable. No idea how it's going to look like in the dark. I mean, it's, it is what it is, right? So we will see, and let us know if you like that. Let us know if that's It's interesting for you if you like that angle. I mean, we've tried the forest walks, we tried the kitchen recording session. That feels a bit more intimate, even though we're, I don't know, the munching and munching and crunching is.
I don't think eating while you're recording anything is really a good idea.
Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see how it sounds like.
Yeah.
Sorry for the multiple interruptions and the cuts and stitches in this video. We'll see. We'll get better. So anyway, if you haven't, please like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments what we should talk about next.
Yeah.
If there's anything, we would love to get in touch with you. We would love for you to leave some comments, and we'll be replying to these comments, especially now that we're getting started and there's not so many comments at all. So yeah.
Thank you for joining us.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.